The history of popular religion in Scotland includes all forms of religion out with the formal theology and structures of institutional religion. Between the earliest times of human occupation of what is now Scotland and the present day, very little is known about religion in Scotland before the arrival of Christianity. It is generally presumed to have resembled Celtic polytheism, and there is evidence of the worship of spirits and wells. The Christianization of Scotland was carried out by Irish-Scots missionaries, and to a lesser extent those from Roman England. From the 6th century, elements of paganism survived into the Christian era. Most early evidence of religious practice is heavily biased towards monastic life. Priests carried out baptisms, masses and burials, prayed for the dead and offered sermons. The Church dictated in moral and legal matters and impinged on other elements of everyday life through its rules on fasting, diet, the slaughter of animals, and rules on purity and ritual cleansing. One of the main features of medieval Scotland was the cult of saints, with shrines devoted to local and national figures, including St. Andrew, and the establishment of pilgrimage routes. Scots also played a major role in the Crusades. Historians have discerned a decline of monastic life in the late medieval period. In contrast, the burghs saw the flourishing of mendicant orders of friars in the later 15th century. As the doctrine of purgatory gained importance, the number of chapelries, priests and masses for the dead within parish churches grew rapidly. New international cults of devotion connected with Jesus and the Virgin Mary began to reach Scotland in the 15th century. Heresy, in the form of lollardry, began to reach Scotland from England and Bohemia in the early 15th century, but did not achieve a significant following. The Reformation, carried out in Scotland in the mid-16th century and heavily influenced by Calvinism, amounted to a revolution in religious practice. Sermons were now the focus of worship. The Witchcraft Act 1563 made witchcraft, or consulting with witches, capital crimes. There were a major series of trials in 1590–91, 1597, 1628–31, 1649–50, and 1661–62. Prosecutions began to decline as trials were more tightly controlled by the judiciary and government. Torture was more sparingly used and standards of evidence were raised. 75% of the accused were women, and modern estimates indicate that over 1,500 persons were executed across the whole period. Scottish Protestantism in the 17th century was highly focused on the Bible, which was seen as infallible and the major source of moral authority. In the mid-17th century, Scottish Presbyterian worship took the form it was to maintain until the liturgical revival of the 19th century, with the adoption of the Westminster Directory in 1643. The 17th century saw the high watermark of kirk discipline, with kirk sessions able to apply religious sanctions, such as excommunication and denial of baptism, to enforce godly behavior and obedience. Kirk sessions also had an administrative burden in the system of poor relief and a major role in education. In the 18th century, there were a series of reforms in church music. Communion was the central occasion of the church, conducted at most once a year, sometimes in outdoor holy fairs. Industrialization, urbanization, and the disruption of 1843 all undermined the tradition of parish schools. Attempts to supplement the parish system included Sunday schools. By the 1830s and 1840s, these had widened to include mission schools, ragged schools, Bible societies, and and improvement classes. After the Great Disruption in 1843, the control of relief was removed from the church and given to parochial boards. The temperance movement was imported from America, and by 1850 it had become a central theme in the missionary campaign to the working classes. Church attendance in all denominations declined after World War I. It increased in the 1950s as a result of revivalist preaching campaigns, particularly the 1955 tour by Billy Graham, and returned to almost pre-war levels. For this point there was a steady decline that accelerated in the 1960s. Sectarianism became a serious problem in the 20th century. This was most marked in Glasgow in the traditionally Roman Catholic team, Celtic, and the traditionally Protestant team, Rangers. Relations between Scotland's churches steadily improved during the second half of the 20th century, and there were several initiatives for cooperation, recognition and union. The foundation of the ecumenical Iona community in 1938 led to a highly influential form of music, which was used across Britain and the US. The Dunblane consultations in 1961–69 resulted in the British hymn explosion of the 1960s, which produced multiple collections of new hymns. In recent years, other religions have established a presence in Scotland, mainly through immigration, including Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism and Sikhism. Other minority faiths include the Baha'i faith and small neo-pagan groups. There are also various organizations which actively promote humanism and secularism. Pre-Christian religion. Very little is known about religion in Scotland before the arrival of Christianity. The lack of native written sources among the Picts means that it can only be judged from parallels elsewhere. Occasional surviving archaeological evidence and hostile accounts of later Christian writers. It is generally presumed to have resembled Celtic polytheism. The names of more than 200 Celtic deities have been noted, some of which, like the Dagda and the Morrigan, come from later Irish mythology, whilst others, like Tutatis, Taranis and Cernunnos, come from evidence from Gaul. The Celtic pagans constructed temples and shrines to venerate these gods, something they did through votive offerings and performing sacrifices, possibly including human sacrifice. According to Greek and Roman accounts, in Gaul, Britain and Ireland, there was a priestly caste of magico-religious specialists known as the Druids, although very little is definitely known about them. Irish legends about the origin of the Picts and stories from the life of St. Ninian associate the Picts with Druids. The Picts are also associated in Christian writing with demon worship, and one story concerning St. Columba has him exorcising a demon from a well in Pictland, suggesting that the worship of well spirits was a feature of Pictish paganism. Roman mentions of the worship of the goddess Minerva at wells, and a Pictish stone associated with a well near Dunvegan Castle on Skye, have been taken to support this case. Early Middle Ages. The Christianization of Scotland was carried out by Irish-Scots missionaries, and to a lesser extent those from Roman England from the 6th century. This movement is traditionally associated with the figures of St. Ninian, St. Kentigern and St. Columba. Elements of paganism survived into the Christian era. Sacred wells and springs became venerated as sites of pilgrimage. Most evidence of Christian practice comes from monks and is heavily biased towards monastic life. For this can be seen the daily cycle of prayers and the celebration of the Mass. Less well recorded, but is significant, was the role of bishops and their clergy. Bishops dealt with the leaders of the Tuath, ordained clergy and consecrated churches. They also had responsibilities for the poor, hungry, prisoners, widows and orphans. Priests carried out baptisms, masses and burials. They also prayed for the dead and offered sermons. They anointed the sick with oil, brought communion to the dying and administered penance to sinners. The Church encouraged almsgiving and hospitality. It also dictated in moral and legal matters, including marriage and inheritance. It also impinged on other elements of everyday life through its rules on fasting, diet, the slaughter of animals, and rules on purity and ritual cleansing. Early local churches were widespread, but since they were largely made of wood, like that excavated at Whithorn, the only evidence that survives for most is in place names that contain words for church, including Sill, both Eccles and Anet, but others are indicated by stone crosses and Christian burials. Beginning on the west coast and islands and spreading south and east, these were replaced with basic masonry-built buildings. Many of these were built by local lords for the tenants and followers, but often retaining a close relationship with monastic institutions. Viking raids began on monasteries like Iona and Lindisfarne began in the 8th century. Orkney, Shetland and the Western Isles eventually fell to the Norsemen, although there is evidence of varying burial rites practiced by Norse settlers in Scotland, such as grave goods found on Colonsay and Westray. There is little that enables a confirmation that the Norse gods were venerated prior to the reintroduction of Christianity. The Odin Stone has been used as evidence of Odinic beliefs and practices, but the derivation may well be from Odin Stone. A few Scandinavian poetic references suggest that Orcadian audiences understood elements of the Norse pantheon, although this is hardly conclusive proof of active beliefs. Nonetheless, it is likely that pagan practices existed in early Scandinavian Scotland. High Middle Ages. One of the main features of medieval Scotland was the cult of saints. Saints of Irish origin who were particularly revered included various figures called St. Fiellan and St. Colman, and Saints Finbar and Finan. Columba remained a major figure into the 14th century, and a new foundation was endowed by William I at Arbroath Abbey. His relics, contained in the Monymusk Reliquary, were handed over to the abbot's care. Regional saints remained important to local identities. In Strathclyde, the most important saint was St. Kentigern, whose cult became focused in Glasgow. In Lothian it was St. Cuthbert, whose relics were carried across the Northumbria after Lindisfarne was sacked by the Vikings before being installed in Durham Cathedral. After his martyrdom around 1115, a cult emerged in Orkney, Shetland and northern Scotland around Magnus Erlingsson, Earl of Orkney. One of the most important cults in Scotland, that of St. Andrew, was established on the east coast at Kilrymont by the Pictish kings as early as the 8th century. The shrine, which from the 12th century was said to have contained the relics of the saint brought to Scotland by St. Regulus, began to attract pilgrims from across Scotland, but also from England and further away. By the 12th century, the site at Kilrymont had become known simply as St. Andrews, and it became increasingly associated with Scottish national identity and the royal family. The site was renewed as a focus for devotion with the patronage of Queen Margaret, who also became important after her canonization in 1250 and after the ceremonial transfer of her remains to Dunfermline Abbey. As one of the most revered national saints, pilgrimage was undertaken to local, national and international shrines for personal devotion, as penance imposed by a priest, or to seek cures for illness or infirmity. Written sources and pilgrim badges found in Scotland, of clay, jet and pewter, indicate journeys undertaken to Scottish shrines and further afield. The most visited pilgrimage sites in late medieval Christendom were Jerusalem, Rome and Santiago de Compostela in Spain, but Scottish pilgrims also visited Amiens in France and Canterbury in England. Scots also played a role in the Crusades. Crusading was preached by friars and special taxation was raised from the late 12th century. A contingent of Scots took part in the First Crusade. Significant numbers of Scots participated in the Egyptian Crusades and the 7th and 8th Crusades, led by Louis IX of France. A later commentator indicated that many of these were ordinary Scotsmen. Many died of disease, including the leaders and Louis himself. This was the last great crusade, although the ideal remained a major concern of late medieval kings, including Robert I and James IV. The Christian calendar incorporated elements of existing practice and dominated the social life of communities. Fairs were held at Whitsun and Martinmas, at which people traded, married, moved house and conducted other public business. The midwinter season of Yule involved 2 weeks of revels in which even the clergy joined in. The Feast of Corpus Christi, focused on the body of Christ and held in June, grew in importance throughout the period. The central occasion of the Christian calendar was Easter. It was preceded by the 40 days of fasting of Lent, during which preachers urged full confession, which took place in church halls by priests and friars. It culminated in Easter Sunday, when most parishioners received their annual communion. Late Middle Ages. Traditional Protestant historiography tended to stress the corruption and unpopularity of the late medieval Scottish Church, but more recent research has indicated the ways in which it met the spiritual needs of different social groups. Historians have discerned a decline of monastic life in this period, with many religious houses keeping smaller numbers of monks, and those remaining often abandoning communal living for a more individual and secular lifestyle. The rate of new monastic endowments from the nobility also declined in the 15th century. In contrast, the burghs saw the flourishing of mendicant orders of friars in the later 15th century, who, unlike the older monastic orders, placed an emphasis on preaching and ministering to the population. The Order of Observant Friars were organized as a Scottish province from 1467, and the older Franciscans and the Dominicans were recognized as separate provinces in the 1480s. In most Scottish burghs, in contrast to English towns where churches and parishes tended to proliferate, there was usually only one parish church. But as the doctrine of purgatory gained importance in the period, the number of chapelries, priests and masses for the dead within them, designed to speed the passage of souls to heaven, grew rapidly. The number of altars dedicated to saints who could intercede in this process also grew dramatically, with St. Mary's in Dundee having perhaps 48 and St. Giles in Edinburgh over 50. The number of saints celebrated in Scotland also proliferated, with about 90 being added to the missal used in St. Nicholas Church in Aberdeen. New international cults of devotion connected with Jesus and the Virgin Mary began to reach Scotland in the 15th century, including the Five Wounds, the Holy Blood and the Holy Name of Jesus, but also St. Joseph Street, and the Three Kings and the Apostles would become more significant in Scotland. There were also new religious feasts, including celebrations of the Presentation, the Visitation and Mary of the Snows. Heresy, in the form of lollardry, began to reach Scotland from England and Bohemia in the early 15th century. Lollards were followers of John Wycliffe and later Jan Hus, who called for reform of the Church and rejected its doctrine on the Eucharist. Despite evidence of a number of burnings of heretics and limited popular support for its anti-sacramental elements, it probably remained a small movement. There were also further attempts to differentiate Scottish liturgical practice from that in England, with a printing press established under royal patent in 1507 in order to replace the English psalm used for services. 16th century. The Reformation, carried out in Scotland in the mid-16th century and heavily influenced by Calvinism, amounted to a revolution in religious practice. It led to the abolition of auricular confession, the wafer in Mass, which was no longer seen as at work, Latin in services, prayers to Mary and the saints, and the doctrine of purgatory. The interiors of churches were transformed, with the removal of the high altar, altar rails, rood screens, choir stalls, side altars, statues and images of the saints. The colourful paintwork of the late Middle Ages was removed, with walls whitewashed to conceal murals. In place of all this were a plain table for communion, pews for the congregation, pulpits and lecterns for the sermons that were now the focus of worship. Printed sermons indicate that they could be as long as 3 hours. Until the 1590s, most parishes were not served by a minister, but by readers, who could not preach or administer the sacraments. As a result, they might only hear a sermon once every 2 weeks, and communion was usually administered once a year on Easter Sunday. In the late Middle Ages there had been a handful of prosecutions for harm done through witchcraft, but the passing of the Witchcraft Act 1563 made witchcraft, or consulting with witches, capital crimes. The first major series of trials under the new act were the North Berwick witch trials, beginning in 1589, in which James VI played a major part as victim and investigator. He became interested in witchcraft and published a defense of witch hunting in the Demonology in 1597, but he appears to have become increasingly skeptical and eventually took steps to limit prosecutions. An estimated 4,000 to 6,000 people, mostly from the Scottish lowlands, were tried for witchcraft in this period, a much higher rate than for neighbouring England. There were a major series of trials in 1590 to 91, 1597, 1628 to 31, 1649 to 50, and 1661 to 62. 75% of the accused were women, and the hunt has been seen as a means of controlling women. Modern estimates indicate that over 1,500 persons were executed across the whole period. 17th century. Scottish Protestantism in the 17th century was highly focused on the Bible, which was seen as infallible and the major source of moral authority. In the early part of the century, the Genevan translation was commonly used. In 1611 the Kirk adopted the Authorised King James Version, and the first Scots version was printed in Scotland in 1633. But the Geneva Bible continued to be employed into the 17th century. Many Bibles were large, illustrated and highly valuable objects. They often became the subject of superstitions, being used in divination. Family worship was strongly encouraged by the Covenanters. Books of devotion were distributed to encourage the practice, and ministers were encouraged to investigate whether this was being carried out. It was in the mid-17th century that Scottish Presbyterian worship took the form it was to maintain until the liturgical revival of the 19th century. The adoption of the Westminster Directory in 1643 meant that the Scots adopted the English Puritan dislike of set forms of worship. The recitation of the Creed, Lord's Prayer, Ten Commandments and doxology were abandoned in favour of the lengthy sermon of the lecture. The centrality of the sermon meant that services tended to have a didactic and wordy in character. The only participation by the congregation was musical, in the singing of the psalms. For the late 17th century the common practice was lining out, by which the precentor sang or read out each line, and it was then repeated by the congregation. The 17th century saw the high water mark of Kirk discipline. Kirk sessions were able to apply religious sanctions, such as excommunication and denial of baptism, to enforce godly behavior and obedience. In more difficult cases of immoral behavior they could work with the local magistrate, in a system modeled on that employed in Geneva. Public occasions were treated with mistrust, and from the later 17th century there were efforts by kirk sessions to stamp out activities such as well-dressing, bonfires, guising, penny weddings and dancing. Kirk sessions also had an administrative burden in the system of poor relief. An Act of 1649 declared that local heritors were to be assessed by kirk sessions to provide the financial resources for local relief, rather than relying on voluntary contributions. By the mid-17th century the system had been rolled out across the lowlands but was limited in the highlands. The system was largely able to cope with general poverty and minor crises, helping the old and infirm to survive and provide life support in periods of downturn at relatively low cost, but was overwhelmed in the major subsistence crisis of the 1690s. The kirk also had a major role in education. Statutes passed in 1616, 1633, 1646 and 1696 established a parish school system, paid for by local heritors and administered by ministers and local presbyteries. By the late 17th century there was a largely complete network of parish schools in the lowlands, but in the highlands basic education was still lacking in many areas. In the 17th century the pursuit of witchcraft was largely taken over by the kirk sessions and was often used to attack superstitious and Catholic practices in Scottish society. The most intense witch hunt was in 1661–62, which involved some 664 named witches in 4 counties. For this point prosecutions began to decline as trials were more tightly controlled by the judiciary and government. Torture was more sparingly used and standards of evidence were raised. There may also have been a growing skepticism, and with relative peace and stability the economic and social tensions that contributed to accusation may have reduced. There were occasional local outbreaks like that in East Lothian in 1678 and 1697 at Paisley. The last recorded executions were in 1706 and the last trial in 1727. The British Parliament repealed the 1563 Act in 1736.